everyone, and welcome to this RSCni video demonstration entitled Digging Deeper into Moodle. In many ways, this demonstration is a follow-on from our webinar entitled Top Tips for Moodle Course Design, and if you're interested in viewing a recording of that webinar, you can find that in the description below. In that webinar, we looked at some general top tips for building a Moodle course, including what best practice is within Moodle course design, the visuals and aesthetics of a Moodle page, how to develop strong communication through a Moodle course, and also building content within the Moodle VLE itself rather than importing it from elsewhere. In this demonstration, we're going to have a look at some features that aren't commonly used within the Moodle VLE and how they can be of benefit to you when designing your Moodle courses for blended learning or distance learning. The demonstration is going to be split up into 3 sections. So we're going to begin by looking at how we can deliver fresh content to the users of our Moodle courses using something called RSS feeds. The main chunk of our video demonstration is going to be taken up by looking at the lesson activity within Moodle, and that's really just a way of building learning objects within the Moodle VLE itself. And finally, we'll have a look at how we can direct online learning using a feature called activity completion, which is particularly strong when designing blended and distance learning courses. Okay, our first little section then is looking at how we can deliver fresh content to your students using something called RSS feeds. Now we'll look a bit further in a minute or two as to what RSS feeds actually are, but the best way to think of them is they're just a way of keeping up to date with your favourite websites, news sites and blogs. We're going to look at how we can use RSS feeds within Moodle, how we can integrate them into our Moodle pages, and then using that, how that lets our students stay up to date with the sites that we feel are very relevant to their studies. This section of the demonstration lasts about 5 minutes. If we've been conscientious and we've built up our Moodle site early on, then our learners will have potentially been looking at the same content and format for a whole year. How do we prevent that from becoming stale for the users? How do we perhaps deliver to them new, fresh and interesting content every single day without too much work on our part? Well, that's our tip here, and that is to use something called RSS feeds, or rich site summary feeds, to bring new content to your users every single day. The way we do that is by coming down our page right to the bottom of our Moodle page and looking for the text add a block. Now in my case it's here on the right hand side of the page, but depending on your theme you might find it over on the left hand side of the page. But under add a block is just simply Moodle's way of describing each of these little bits of content that are off to the side of the Moodle page. So each one of these things is a block. If we come into add a block and click the drop down arrow, we'll find towards the bottom remote RSS feeds, which is this rich site summary feeds that I'm talking about. When we click into that, it will add a little block like this one here that I've added beforehand into our Moodle site, and it's telling us to click the edit icon to configure it and display the feeds. So the little edit icon is the little, in my case, this little cog, and we're going to click on that and click configure news feed. So that takes us into the configuration settings for this RSS feed. But before we look any further at our settings here, what actually is an RSS feed? How can we understand what it is? Well, if I pop over to another tab I have open here, which is the Guardian newspaper. In this case, it's the environment section of the Guardian newspaper, because I think that that would relate to this fictitious course that I have on environmental care. Something like a newspaper or a news website like the BBC News or otherwise are publishing new stories each and every day. They're publishing new content each and every day. And back in 1999, someone realized that we should harness that to take that fresh content and be able to view that from other places. And to do that, they developed RSS feeds. RSS feeds are denoted by this little orange icon that you can see my mouse hovering around now. And if I click into that, you'll see what kind of the RSS feed in its raw state is. So each of these little links denotes a brand new news story that this Guardian environment has published. And each of these news stories is a new little section of the RSS feed. Tomorrow morning, where we look at it, we may have 4 more stories as part of this feed. And that translates through to the little block that we're going to put in our Moodle page, because every time the Guardian environment updates with a news story, that brand new news story is going to appear in our little feed box. What we need to do is we need to take this link up here for the RSS feed itself, and we need to right click and copy that, because we're going to use this address momentarily. We're going to pop back to our configuring our RSS feed here, and it asks me to choose which feed I would like to make available. Now, it's not one of the previous ones I've used, so I'm going to have to click add or edit feeds. That launches this new page which displays all of the feeds that I've previously added. I'm going to add a new one now for this Guardian environment feed. So just click on add a new feed, and in here I'm going to paste in the link that I copied and give it a title, and just click add, and that'll save that for me. So now whenever I pop back to my configuration block and refresh it, we'll have this new feed to add in. So back on my configuration page now, I see my Guardian environment news feed has popped up. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to say that I want 3 brand new news entries in the block at any one time. I can give it a title, so we'll just do the same thing again. Guardian environment. And down at the bottom then, we're just going to click Save Changes. So that takes us back to your main course page, where if we scroll on down through the page, we'll see here that our RSS feed block has now transformed into a fully fledged news report. So the most recent ones at the top, we only specified we wanted 3, so that's them all there. But tomorrow those will be replaced with new news stories, or each time a new news story comes up, there'll be a new one put in there. We can use the little up, down, left, right arrow to just grab this and move it up to the top of our page to somewhere a little more prominent. So say right at the top of our page, just let go of that to drop it in there. And there we go. Whenever our students come to our course page, they'll see brand new news stories each and every day. If you do any kind of simple Google search for the topic that you're teaching or the course that you're involved with, you'll find potentially thousands of these RSS feeds that you could harness. The key is going to be finding ones that are actually useful content, because like everything else on the internet, it's about finding a balance. There's often really content that's either not appropriate or not useful for your class. So pick and choose the right RSS feeds to use, and you'll find that you can constantly deliver that new and fresh material to your students. Okay, in the next section then of our demonstration, which is the longest section, we're going to look at the lesson activity within Moodle. As part of our webinar entitled Top Tips for Moodle Course Design, we were asked the question what the difference between a book and a lesson is within Moodle. A book being something that we looked at in that Top Tips for Moodle Course Design webinar. A book is simply a collection of information, so it's a way to collate information together in one place for our users to look at. A lesson, by contrast, is an interactive learning object that incorporates the same kind of content that we'd have in a book, but also elements of practice and assessment pulled all together in one convenient learning object. In this section of the demonstration, we're going to look at how we can integrate the lesson activity into our Moodle courses. That allows us to build learning content within Moodle itself. It also, because it flows as a learning object, it's pedagogically sound in terms of delivering the right content to the learners in the right order. It also provides elements of formative and summative assessment, which are recorded by the VLE, allowing you as the lecturer or teacher to track how your students are getting on and how they are making progress through their learning. This section of the video lasts around 20 minutes. Okay, I'm here on my fictitious Moodle course page, and I want to add a lesson learning object into this topic here, topic 2, alternative energy. To do that, I'm going to come down to add an activity or resource, click that, and then from the activities menu, choose lesson and click add. So the first screen we enter here is asking us to set up the lesson itself, the options regarding it. The first thing we need to do is give it a name, so I'll drop in a name that is in relation to this topic too, alternative energy. And then below that we have a whole list of settings regarding the lesson. Now I'm not going to go through them all now just to save time, but there is lots of help available for this on the Moodle website. And on top of that, if I drop down any one of these little subsections, you'll see that almost everything has a little question mark next to the option itself, and clicking that will give you more information about what those menu options actually do. So there's plenty of support there to guide you through those different menu options. The one thing that I do want to draw your attention to is this option here, prerequisite lesson. I think this is the real strength of the lesson learning object within Moodle. If I drop into this, what you'll see is the first box we have is a dependent on box with a drop down menu next to it. Now in this fictitious Moodle course I'm working on, I have no other lessons. This would be the first lesson I'd be creating. If I had created other lessons, however, they would appear in this drop down menu. What this lets us do then is it lets us make this current lesson that we're creating, alternative energy and why we need it, dependent on another lesson that we've already created in the course. That means that this particular lesson that we're working on at the minute, alternative energy and why we need it, won't open up until students have spent a certain amount of time in that previous learning object, completed that learning object, or achieved a certain grade in that learning object. I think that's the real strength of the lessons in the Moodle virtual learning environment. You can set up this really clear structure to your lessons so as they kind of work pedagogically and flow naturally. Students can't complete lesson number 2 until they have spent a certain amount of time in lesson number 1, so they're getting all the information they need before they move on. Once I have all of my settings finalized for this particular lesson that I'm setting up now, I simply click Save and Display, and then we're going to start to populate this lesson with the information we want. Okay, we're into the main body of our lesson learning object now, and we're going to start to fill it with information, just as we would any other learning object. Moodle's asking us what we would like to do first, and it's given me some options here, which I just want to take a very brief look at. The two options that I'm going to focus on in this little tutorial is adding a content page and adding a question page, because those are the two main things that we're going to be working with in our learning objects. The other objects that are there are very useful. I'm just not going to go into detail about them today. Import questions is pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. If you have a set of questions already prepared, usually in Econ format, you can import them into the Moodle lesson and just draw from those without having to retype them all out. Adding a cluster is a little more complex. It's one of the reasons why we're not going to look at it today, but suffice to say that really all it is, it's a mechanism whereby you can draw from random question pages. So a cluster is a facility whereby if you just want students to receive one out of a random selection of question pages, or receive a bunch of question pages in a different order that their peers will receive it in, to do that you'll be using a cluster. So we're not going to look at those today, adding a cluster, importing questions. We're going to focus on adding a content page and adding a question page. Okay, so the two main types of pages we're going to look at are the content page and the question page. The content page is a page that contains just learning information for students, some information for them to process and digest. That might be sound, it might be video, it might just be textual. A question page can contain those elements as well, but a question page will also incorporate some form of assessment, either summative or formative, depending on what you want that to be as the teacher. And both are very important, and I think really a really important step when you're going to make a learning object anywhere, whether it's in Moodle or it's in Articulate or in Xerti, is understanding how you want to arrange your content and your questions within that learning object. You want to try and make sure that the pedagogy learning object is sound. You want to make sure there's an educational process taking place, and you want to make sure that the student has learned something through some kind of assessment. So it's important to think about the objective that you have when you're sitting down to create your learning object, what you want your students to come out of the learning object knowing, how to arrange the content to achieve that objective, and then how to insert these little formative or summative assessments, these little mini questions the whole way through, to give the student an idea of how they're progressing and to give you as a teacher an idea that there actually is learning taking place. So that's worthwhile sitting down to think about before you begin to structure your learning object. I have some material standing by that I can just drop into this. So I'm going to begin by adding my contents page. And the contents page, my first contents page really, is just going to introduce the student to the learning object. So I'm going to click Add a Content Page. I'm going to give it a title here. So we're just simply going to call it Introduction. And then in the contents, I'm just going to drop in my section of text that introduces the student to the learning object. And also gives them a flavour of what I'm hoping that they're going to learn throughout this learning object. And again, with Moodle, we have our little text editor here, so we can embolden parts of the text or add links in if we want to. I'll just leave it as is at the minute. There are a couple of options below the actual information that's going into the textual information that's going into our page. Contents buttons is something we're going to come to in 2 seconds, so I'm just going to leave that for the meantime. Display in left menu is a little indication as to whether or not this particular page of the learning object will be available in a little menu that will sit on the left hand side of the student's web page as they're navigating through the learning object. So if you want the page to be hidden and not appear, you can simply deselect that little option there. Okay, coming into the contents buttons then, this is really the way in which the learning object is navigated through. Okay, the word content can sometimes deceive folks whenever they're building a lesson object within Moodle here. But really the way to think about content and these content buttons, which is, we've seen the phrase used up here, content buttons, is to think of them as the little navigational buttons that are going to take our student through the learning object. So how do they progress from page 1 to page 2 to page 3 and so on and so forth? They're going to do that by clicking on navigation buttons, and those navigation buttons are what Moodle is calling content. Content 1, Content 2, Content 3. So you can see here we can have up to 4 buttons at the bottom of our learning object that takes our students to different places within that learning object. We can also choose how to arrange those. Do we want them to be arranged one beside the other in a horizontal line, or one above the other in a vertical line? I'm going to keep them horizontally here. So we've got to fill in a couple of things here. We've got to fill in description, and we've got to fill in the jump. Now description is just what's going to appear in that little button. What the button itself is actually going to say. The jump is a little more complicated, and the jump is just referring to where the button navigates to. So if a student clicks on this Content 1 button, where does it take them? So I want to take a minute or two and just step out of the Moodle interface here to consider these jumps and consider how we can lay them out. Okay, so we'll just take a break for a minute or two from the Moodle interface proper, just to think about the way in which users navigate through our learning objects, which we set up through these content buttons and these jumps. So I want to take a look a minute or two here just at how that's done. And what I have on screen here is a sort of a very typical screen from a learning object. We've got some content, we've got an image, we've got some text that would be read through, and then we've got our navigation buttons here. So within Moodle, these navigation buttons, these 2 navigation buttons we can see here, are what Moodle refers to as the content buttons. Okay, so just to remind you then that whenever you see this word content, Content 1, Content 2, etc. in Moodle, that's referring to these navigation buttons. And each one of these is a different content button. So this might be Content 1, this might be Content 2. So that's what that word content again means, just as a refresher. Now in Moodle they don't look so much like that. In Moodle the little content buttons are more along the lines of something like this. And the reason for that is that Moodle will let us type some text into these buttons to let the user know where the navigation button is going to take them to. So something along the lines of this, typical little kind of back button and also a next button. And that text that's typed inside the content button is what Moodle refers to as the description. So again, just a reminder of that where you see here in the Moodle interface the word description, that's just referring to the text that you'll see inside your navigation buttons. Now within Moodle, and within any kind of learning object, we're not just going to have one page like the one we have here on screen. In fact, if anything, it's more likely that we'll have a series of pages. I've shown 3 here, but realistically, we're going to be looking at maybe up to 20 pages in a learning object. When a user navigates through that, they're going to click on our little navigational buttons. So when a user from page 1 clicks on the next button, we would expect them to jump to page 2. Whenever the user clicks on the next button on page 2, we would expect them to move on to page 3. If by page 3 they've changed their mind and they want to go back and reread some of the material on page 3, they might click the back button, and we would want the back button then to take them back to page 2. So each of these individual little steps are what Moodle refers to as the jumps. Jumping from one page to another, or jumping back from one page to a previous page. So again, just to remind you then, when you see in the Moodle lesson creation editor here, you see the word jump. Jump is referring to whenever a user clicks this button, where is it going to take them to? Now I've just used back and next as an example, but Moodle's quite flexible. You can have lots of content buttons and you can have them going to different places. So instead of here where I have back and next, I can instead have something like a next button and an end button. So if a user, for instance, clicked the next button, I would have that set up so that it jumps from page 1 to page 2. If a user, however, clicked the end button, we would set that jump to be from page 1 to page 3, right to the end of our learning object. So that's really just a very, very short introduction to how the navigation buttons, the content, the description, and the jumps all come together to create a navigational structure within a Moodle lesson. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about how the jumps work and how they're organized, I'm going to simply call this button just next. And I'm going to say the jump is going to go to the next page, so it's going to just move through the learning object in a kind of logical progression. I'm going to save that page, and that's my first page then of my Moodle lesson complete. Okay, so you'll notice now that Moodle's told me that we've inserted our first page, introduction. So now I have my introductory page sitting in here. I can jump into that at any time and view it or edit it if I need to. What I can also do though is my final column here says actions, and this allows me to add a new page, and you can see again there's some of these repeated types of pages that we looked at initially. There's the cluster, which we're not going to look at. There's the end of clusters, which applies to that as well. We've also got our content page and our question page, which is the ones we're going to look at. Now I'm only going to add a few in this initial learning object just to give you an idea, but I'm going to add a second content page here. So we've introduced our students to the learning content. Now we're going to move into the content proper. So I'm going to click add a contents page, and that then will automatically generate a second content page within the learning object for me to work with. Okay, so again the first thing we need to do is give our page a title. I'm going to call this one Dirty Energy and its effects. And then we're going to put again information into our page for our students to view. Now again, I've just put text in here, but bear in mind there are other options. We can add a picture in if we want to add, say, a little chart or an image. We can add a video or sound bite in if we want to have ourselves talking in the learning object, or if we want to show a video to your students as part of this content. Or we have our little HTML editor here, which will let you drop in YouTube videos or links to, or embedded links to online resources, those kind of things. I'm going to keep mine just textual at the minute. We're going to move on down then to our contents again. So we've a slightly different setup now here, because now we have one page already created within our lesson. So when I look at the jumps that are offered, you'll note that one of the jumps that I have is I can jump back to the introduction. That's a page that now exists, and we can go back to that if we want. So for content 1, our first button, what I'm going to say in it is that I'm just going to say next again, and I'm going to offer the jump just to the next page again, progressing logically through the object. However, what I'm also going to do, again bearing in mind the discussion we had about the jumps, is I can add in content 2, a second button. I'm going to call it back, and the jump for it I'm going to say previous page. So if the students click on this button, they'll go to the next page. If they click on this button, they'll go back to the introductory page. And after that I'm just going to click save page to finish that one off. Okay, so I've added an extra contents page in there just outside of the video, just to give the learning object a little more meat. But I want to move on now to our question pages, because it's a really important aspect of the Moodle lesson activity. So when I come to add a new page, again, I suppose one thing to note here about the structure of this actions column is that I can click and add a new page next to any of these pages that already exist. Doing that will drop the new page in below whichever page I've chosen. So if I actually realize that I've missed a page between introduction and dirty energy and its effects, I can come up to introduction, click add a new page and choose which type, and that'll slot that page in here between the two of them. I want to add mine in though after coal, oil and natural gas, this one that I've added outside of the video. So I'm going to click add a new page and I'm going to choose question, so we can have a look at how to build our question. Okay, we'll take a very brief look at the types of questions that are available, and we're not going to get time today to just explore them all. You'll note there's a number of them here. We've got 6 different options of the types of questions we're going to use. We can split these really into 2 categories. We've got essay and we've got short answer. These questions are kind of more subjective in terms of they're questions that the teacher yourself will have to mark before the student actually gets a result within their learning object. So for instance, an essay is not something that the lesson itself can mark. It's not something that the student can be given a mark on within the learning object. So you can include an essay question into the end of your learning object. The student would type that up at the end of the learning object and submit it. However, you'll have to mark and grade that. Whereas question types like matching, multi-choice, numerical and true or false are ones that will be answered there and then by the student, and that Moodle will detect whether or not the student has given the correct answer. That opens up more options within the learning object itself, because you can then use these questions to direct the flow of the learning object, and that's what we're going to look at right now. I'm going to choose multi-choice because it's a fairly popular type of question. I'm just going to click on multi-choice and choose add a question page. Okay, so we're going to add our multi-choice question here. So we need to add a page title first of all, as always. I'm just going to call this one Summary Quiz. And then we put in our contents. Now the important thing to remember about adding the contents to this particular page is, like I mentioned at the very start, we can include learning information here if we want to. We could put in, again, pictures, videos, or little embedded objects if we want to. We can add text content if we want to. But the important thing to remember is that we need to also include the question that we're posing on this particular page. So I'm going to just drop in a very short little bit of text here. Answer the following question based on the notes on fossil fuels, and then the question itself in bold. So I've asked a question, and now we're ready to offer the multiple choice answers to the students. And again, that's just because I'm using multiple choice here. If you'd chosen true or false, there would be, those options would be predetermined. If you'd chosen matching, then you would need to add in the different columns and options for the matching question. If you'd chosen essay, it would just be as simple as providing the instructions for how the students would be answering their essay. But we're coming down to the answers for multiple choice questions. It can have multiple answers. If it's a question like something like of the 6 options below, choose the 3, etc, etc. And if that were the case, you would need to choose multiple answers. Mine's only going to have 1 correct answer, so we're going to put those in now. Okay, so I've asked the question up here. Many countries, including the UK, are switching over to power stations fired by which fossil fuel? So I'm going to choose the first answer here is going to be natural gas, which is the correct answer. Because that's the correct answer, as a response, so if the student chooses this answer, what is the learning object going to tell them? Well, I'm going to just say the response for this is going to be, that's correct, well done. But you could go into more information if you wanted to. This is an option for you to actually provide really valuable feedback to a student as they go through the learning object. So you could add in a fact or a statistic or an interesting piece of information for this correct answer if you wanted to. Now, this is where the learning object really starts to come alive. You'll note now that for each answer that we are providing here, answer 1, answer 2, answer 3, and so on, we have a potential jump. So where the learning object goes to if the student chooses this particular answer. So the score set up, they're going to gain a point here for this answer because it's the correct one. But if they choose it, where are they going to go? Well, we can have them progress to the next page if we want them to, because they've successfully answered the question. Or just in the case of what I'm doing at the minute, I'm going to say we're going to go to the end of lesson because they've answered it correctly. Now if you were doing this learning object, you might well have 15 or 20 pages, whereas really I'm only working with 3 or 4 here. But because I'm saying the student has answered question 1 correctly, they're going to finish the lesson successfully. Now if we come down to answer 2, however, this is going to be an incorrect answer. So I'm going to say as a second answer, cool. The response is going to be, that's not correct. And I'm going to say read through the notes again. And again, if you were putting this in, you could use this space to provide really, really valuable feedback. Mine's just a very generic answer. Now because I've told them that they've got this answer incorrect and I want them to read through the notes again, the jump for this can take them back to the previous page where the notes were. So if they answer cool as the answer, which is incorrect, then they'll have to go back and read through the previous page again. So choosing answer 2 is a jump back to the previous page. And I can say the same thing for answer 3. And we can say the answer is oil. We'll just copy and paste our response, but again, if you were doing this, you could put really valuable feedback in here, and we'll say our jump's going to go to the previous page. And you'll note that the score for both of the incorrect answers are 0. And that's us finished with the question, so we can click Save Page. And we have directed our students then through that question. If they answer it correctly, they finish the learning object successfully. If they answer it incorrectly, they have to go back to here, the notes on coal, oil and natural gas, and read through them again, and then come back to the quiz. Now again, if you imagine yourselves doing these learning objects, you might well have 4 times the number of pages I would have, and your jumps could be really intricate. You could have a quiz here that jumps to slide 10 for much further on down the learning object. You could have jumps that take student to the end of the quiz once they finish their final summary quiz. You could have jumps that take students back 3 or 4 slides right to the beginning of a section if they get a question wrong, so they have to keep going through the notes until they get it right. And that's the value of a learning object in Moodle. I hope that's been a really helpful introduction to it, and I hope that you can experiment with the lesson activity yourselves. In this last section of our video demonstration, we're going to look at how we can more successfully direct online learning using a feature within Moodle called activity completion. Activity completion in Moodle allows us to control how students move through our VLE content. In other words, it doesn't just open up the entire VLE for them at once, it allows them to systematically move and flow through the content that we've put online. This kind of flow control moves us closer to a more useful model of blended learning. Before using activity completion within your VLE, as you'll see a little minute or two as we move into the demonstration, there's a few things that you do need to check. You need to check with your VLE support team as to whether activity completion is turned on your Moodle site. You then also need to think about the flow of the content that you're going to be using and how one part moves into another, because unless your content is arranged in the correct order, activity completion and the flow that it provides is not going to be of any use. And finally, if you're considering using activity completion to promote blended learning, don't simply place your existing content online. Think about redesigning some of the content that you have so it lends itself better to the idea of blended learning. Hopefully the video demonstration will give you some more ideas about what activity completion is and how it might work, and it lasts around 5 minutes. So our last thought then when it comes to designing your Moodle course really revolves around an option in Moodle that may not be turned on your Moodle course page. In fact, it may not be turned on your Moodle site because by default it's not activated whenever Moodle's installed. So for a lot of us, what we might need to do, if this becomes something that we're interested in, we might need to go off and speak to our IT teams or Moodle administrators and see if there's a good reason why they haven't yet activated it. The sort of title for this particular mechanism within Moodle that we're going to think about is activity completion. And the tip that revolves around it really is using activity completion to move your course from just a repository of information, just a place on the internet where you put files, to an actual blended learning approach to learning, somewhere whereby you can place material that your students can work on outside of class, but more than that, that you can track and that they can track to see how their progress is going moving through the course. If we look at the little topic that's sitting in front of us here now on our screen, I have turned activity completion on my Moodle site, and I've also turned it on in a few of these activities and resources. And they're denoted by this little checkbox. And if I hover over, say, take for instance this little introductory page of notes here, if I hover over that, what you can see in my little mouse tooltip says is that students can manually mark this item complete. What that means is that if I'm running this course, say, as a blended learning course, and I've told my students, or a flipped classroom, or whatever approach that you're thinking of, and I've told my students to go off and read through this content or watch this video or whatever, once they've done that, I'll expect them to check that off in their course. If they're really keen on learning, if they're a class that you can trust and engage with, you'll know that they're checking that off reliably, that they'll checking it off in a trustworthy manner to tell you how much they've got done. You can identify who's fallen behind or who needs to be caught up or who's really far ahead. It's also useful from their perspective because they know that as the student what they've looked at, they know what they've seen, and they've worked their way through. But there's other ways you can use activity completion that isn't just sort of in terms of a little manual setup that students can check things off as they work through. So if we have a look at how we actually set it up for a particular activity or resource, here's for instance a collection of lecture slides from a PowerPoint presentation. If I pop over to the edit icon and click on edit settings to go into the options for these PowerPoint slides, we'll see how we can manipulate the settings for activity completion. So once my settings load, these are all things that I have programmed in for this particular set of PowerPoint slides in the past, things like the name and the description. But if we scroll on down, because I've activated this from a Moodle site, my very last option is this activity completion. I can expand this option a wee bit and we can have a look at the different options. So I have it set currently to students can manually mark the activity as completed. If we didn't want that, if we wanted to put stricter conditions on how an activity becomes completed, we could drop this down and say, for instance, change that to show activity as complete when conditions are met. And from there we can, say, program that in to be something like require view. The activity completion doesn't actually check off until our students physically look at the document, or in this case the PowerPoint slides. So I know whenever I go in and look at my students' course completion, I'll know when things are checked off that they've actually downloaded those PowerPoint slides, or they've looked at a video, or they've engaged with a forum, or whatever the case might be, because these options change depending on what the activity is. So on something like a forum, you can have your options to be dependent on the activity not being completed until they physically post it in the forum. You can see how that could be used then to build up quite a clear picture of how blended learning is working on your course. But on top of that, just as a slightly further step along that we're not really going to look at or think about today, but with activity completion there also comes a sort of a second step further on down the line, and that's something called activity dependency. And if you get your head around activity completion and that's working well, then the next step is activity dependency. And the way that activity dependency works is that certain activities don't open up or become available until a previous activity has been marked as completed. So if we had, say, 10 PowerPoint presentations representing our 10 lectures, lecture number 2 wouldn't become available until lecture number 1 had been completed and the students had downloaded or viewed that. Or forum number 2 wouldn't open up until the students had replied or responded to forum number 1. And you can see how activity completion and activity dependency could be used to really build up that blended learning approach and to keep track of where each of your students are. So I hope that gives you some food for thought regarding activity completion and how you might use it now with your courses. Okay, that concludes our video demonstration entitled Digging Deeper into Moodle. Thanks very much for your time. If you have any further questions or feedback on this particular demonstration, please do use the comments section below to generate some feedback and discuss best practice with others who have viewed the video. Or alternatively, you can contact us at the address shown on screen. Thanks again for your time.